So we're really excited because we'd love to show that doing something for the social good is cost beneficial and is something that can be economically feasible.
You're listening to the Architect My Life podcast, a podcast dedicated to helping empower women creative entrepreneurs such as architects and designers have it all: business growth, financial freedom, and health and wellness. I'm Shlachter, your host and CEO of MGS Global Group. This podcast is also brought to you by the MGS Global Group. We provide BIM modeling and drafting services to overwhelmed architects and design firm owners. Now let's dive into this episode.
Hi everyone, our guest today is Andrea Steele. Andrea Steele has over 2 decades of experience in practicing architecture and has led a variety of complex urban design projects throughout the United States. She served as a partner and principal of 10 Arquitectos New York office for more than 8 years before renaming the studio in 2019 to Andrea Steele Architecture. She received her Master's of Architecture from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, has taught several architecture studios including Cornell University, and is the recipient of numerous awards, most recently a New York AIA Honor Award for the New York Public Library project on Manhattan's 53rd Street. She lectures widely throughout the United States, is a frequent participant in academic juries, and serves as an advisor to the Urban Design Forum and Pioneer Works. I'm so thrilled to talk to her today. Welcome to the show, Andrea.
Thank you for having me. This is great. Long time coming.
I know. So I always ask my guests, why architecture? And do you have a person or experience that prompted you or inspired you to get into architecture?
That's a really good, that's a good question. I mean, I guess in terms of kind of a quick summary of maybe why I was here, because I think the last time you and I spoke, it prompted some nostalgic recollection that I hadn't done in quite a while. But I was raised by 2 Peace Corps volunteers, so I guess the social responsibility and the thought of how to make the world a better place was a daily mantra in my household. I went off to college to study what I thought was going to be neuroscience, because I was interested in how the brain facilitates, or even sometimes not, our connections with mind and body, and the world around us. And then I ended up taking an architecture class for what I thought would be an easy elective, fell into it quite really by accident, but at the same time felt that the connections that I was seeking, those connections of what connects us to each other and what connects us to nature and the world around us, was by design architecture. So I think I continued to study what I sought out to. I just didn't realize it would be in that vein. I guess, I got to wear black instead of white, but and then I would say, in terms of inspiration, after undergraduate, I went to the GSD, obviously surrounded by, at the time it was Max Scoggin, running the program, and he brought in, the most incredible diversity of professors. So you had the bold ideas of Zaha and Rem and Herzog and Demeron. But on the other hand, I think my greatest influence came from the relationship with Samuel Mockbee and seeing what he was doing with Rural Studio. And he really changed the way I thought about the architect's role. And so after graduation, I went off to Baltimore, and there, I guess it was a great opportunity, because I think most of my classmates went to New York, Boston, LA, and most of them kind of questioned, why the hell was I going to Baltimore? And that just gave me such hands-on experience to work directly with the community, with the client, in a way that, quite frankly, was well above my experience level, and ended up getting to see from concept to execution to, at the time, was called green building. I don't even know that LEED existed. This was, in 96 to 98, 99. So, this green architecture, this green building, without even the word kind of sustainability, really kind of fostered the ideas I think that we're finally getting to realize in their true form now.
So you're ahead of the game already. You started sustainable architecture way back. So how did you end up in New York City and starting your own firm?
Yeah, that's a good question too. um, so I was absolutely happy working on the projects that I was working on in Baltimore. The experience was really fulfilling. Like I said, we were doing this great sustainable work that at the time seemed very groundbreaking. Most of the materials and people I was collaborating with, it wasn't even commercial. Some of the materials were being made in people's basements, and it was all very prototypical. So I was very intrigued by that. And again, working with artists and artisans beyond just contractors. But the opportunity, my boyfriend at the time, who is now my husband, was given this wonderful promotion, and he asked, do we want to go to New York? And really, as an architect, I feel like you just expect to be in New York at some point in your career. I didn't expect it to be at that moment, and I said, yes, let's do it. Went to my firm at the time in tears, saying that I would regrettably have to leave, and was completely shocked when they turned around and said, or how about you open an office for us in New York? So I with, really no experience of opening up a new office, I did that at the time that we were establishing that new presence. We met Enrique Norton, and he was doing the very same thing, kind of feeling out, how would there be a place for 10 Arquitectos in New York? Obviously, he and they were very well established and building an incredible reputation, and wanted to test the waters in New York.
Mexico City, right? At that time,
this is the 10 Arquitectos.
10 Arquitectos
yeah, so they had the office
City.
in Mexico City, right. And so what I did was we found a studio in Dumbo, which at the time had nothing. We were in a loft space, nothing around us. At the time, there was one pizza parlor that you could eat lunch and hope that you kind of couriered your one slice of pizza before all the cheese slipped off. But anyway, and so I opened the office there really as a test lab for both the Baltimore firm and 10 Arquitectos. And we started to bring in work. I started to hire, the studio grew. And then, what was wonderful was really those two firms kind of took flight in different directions. One became, Barbara Wilkes in the wonderful W Architecture, landscape architecture. And she's been thriving ever since in New York. And then obviously 10 Arquitectos has always, done really, really well, but became established in New York. So just as, I helped kind of facilitate the growth and success of those two firms, I said, well, I'm going to leave. I'm going to have my first child and start my own firm, because how hard could either one be?
Of course, it's not hard.
Yeah. Right. And so with that naivete and foolish courage, I did just that. My firm took off. I started to build the staff and build projects, build clients. And I never marketed, because I was lucky enough that, we did everything from gallery spaces to mixed use residential, school. We had several repeat school clients, but we never promoted, because just the word of mouth and the relationships we were creating. And I probably had a very false sense of how work comes into an office, just because that was my first experience. And several years into that, Enrique reached out to me seemingly out of the blue and said, how about, you come back, we join forces, you bring your studio, it would still remain your studio, but if you could also run the New York office, 10 Arquitectos New York office, as managing principal. So, of course, again, I say, yes, of course, jump in, and was running both of those studios. But the reality was we were one group of people, in one studio together, having the same conversations, the same discourse about what does it mean to work within public space? What does it mean to build communities? And, when you're managing kind of two different businesses and the finances of it and the emails of it and all of that, I said, I really don't care what the name on the door is. That doesn't matter to me. All that matters is the work that we do. So we brought everybody together, the staff together, and merged the two offices. And I continued running that office for, I guess, about 9 years. And in 2019, with that 9 years of experience of, nurturing a great studio, an incredible diverse talent of people and experiences, and fostering great relationships like NASA and so many of our cultural city and community clients, it just seemed like it was time to kind of evolve that office into what I'd hoped would be kind of the next, phase of my life. And so Enrique and I decided that I would transition the office, take that same beautiful collection of people and projects and rename it Andrea Steele Architecture. So that was in 2019. A wonderful moment to announce, the new firm when 3 months later the whole world shuts down. But actually, in hindsight, having that moment to just put your head down and just work and immerse yourself in the studio, during the time of COVID, obviously the world is turned upside down and everyone's focus is on life and safety and family and understanding what this means when we were all forced into our own silos. And it really, made me, and I imagine most of the world, reflect on what's important, right? What fulfills us. Architecture, I think it's fair to say architecture is not instant gratification. There are some projects that will take years, if not decades, to see realized. So it's really important to make the day-to-day fulfillment something that, drives you and pushes you to do better tomorrow and put forth great ideas that you feel make a difference, make an impact both on the wonderful people that work within your studio and then the people that you work for as clients in the larger community. So, and that's kind of, I would love to say we're post-COVID. I'm not sure what people are accepting as the term, but I do think that we seem to be coming out of a clearing. And however we want to describe it, turning the corner, or everyone just, regardless of what is really happening, I think the entire world is just ready to get down to business and have an impact. So we're excited to kind of be in this moment.
That's great. I know that the hospitality industry was very impacted during this time. And I see that you're doing a very exciting project where you're collaborating with the hospitality and education programs, the Agricultural Center. I like that, Agricultural Center. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we made that up. It's a great project. So we had been working with a developer for quite some time. She and I have been trying to find a way to redefine what a community center is within an urban environment. We kind of started this conversation in Harlem to say, how do you, what is the greatest impact that we can have at this moment in time? What are the resources that some of these urban communities need? And obviously, you can never solve for everything. You can't, build within one single community center all of it, but is there something that at least as a pilot project would foster, we were talking just a few minutes ago about sustainability. We like to think about sustainability in a greater sense, beyond the preservation of natural resources is, how do you design a project to ensure that you have a social, cultural, and financially resilient model. As an architect, you can't just design for day one, ribbon cutting, walk away and think you've done your job. How do you ensure that that client or that college, institution, community group, whoever it is, has been provided a piece of infrastructure that facilitates and optimizes, who they are and what they do. So the developer and our team were trying to figure out what that perfect mix of program could be and how a community center could be financially viable. And in doing so, and we got to talk to a lot of great people who had lots of thoughts in terms of what the greatest needs were, we ended up connecting with this wonderful woman, Representative Sherry Dorsey. And, we ended up having the opportunity to meet with a wonderful state representative in Wilmington, Delaware, who, for those of you that don't know, Wilmington, Delaware is considered kind of the number one agricultural state. And I presume that's for some metric that's beyond just square feet of farm, which I imagine maybe Texas beats them. But and she had this idea of bringing agriculture to some of her more impoverished neighborhoods. And therefore, what we're looking at now and the pilot project we're designing is to bring a vertical farm to Wilmington, Delaware, to Hedgeville, which is a neighborhood in southwest Wilmington. The idea being that it's not just enough to give them access to healthy, fresh produce. You can make that produce physically accessible by being within the neighborhood. You can make it cost effective, but if you don't give them all the other resources to make it part of their daily life, then perhaps, it's not being used. So what we realize is that, an architect often realizes buildings, but I think we shouldn't assume as architects that a building is the, let's say, ultimate outcome. I think ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to build communities and we're trying to foster a sense of learning through the design process. And that can either result in a building or not result in a building. But I guess the bigger thing I find our responsibility to be is actually breaking down boundaries. And we realized that there were a series of barriers that were preventing the community from accessing resources, sometimes even free resources. So when we started speaking to the community, there are questions about, well, how is this food prepared? And, is it something that's easily done? What does farming have to do with me? I live in downtown Wilmington. I'm not a farmer. And is there an opportunity for job creation? So the project incorporates the vertical farm, which obviously is a very technical piece. There has to be the optimized lighting and water and all these other things to foster this wonderful food production. But the wonderful thing about that is that you can pretty much guarantee the food that's produced there. But the more interesting thing is thinking about the food production within the larger spectrum of our everyday life and the life of the city. And so the idea that this agricultural center could incorporate a gallery for which, it's about the different seeds that are produced, or it's understanding what the impact of farming has on the world and how a vertical farm, reduces the carbon footprint. It's understanding, a demonstration kitchen to teach, everyone from youth and older how to prepare foods and not just about the learning. It's the community building that happens and fostered by bringing people together kind of for that reason. So we're really excited because we'd love to show that doing something for the social good is cost beneficial, right? And is something that can be economically feasible. So the agricultural center is that combination of vertical farm, of public space, of wellness gardens, classroom, potentially a grocery store, juice bar, or, restaurant or something that gives job creation, for the retail and the education component. So we're really excited.
So,
We're in the process now of defining the pilot project for which we'll look to see this executed in Wilmington as the first, learn from that experience, build it, test it, be a part of it after the ribbon cutting, and then use what we've learned, both as it relates to how the built infrastructure supported the programming to, how it's impacting the neighborhood. Was it as we had planned? Is it doing something better or worse than we thought it was? And then also kind of understanding the business model behind this, hopefully kind of new social model. So
that's great.
kind of
So I like how you look at it as a holistic approach between the building, people, culture, context, environment, sustainability. So do you have a design yet, or you're still looking for a site so you can test it out? Is there something we can see online? Because it sounds so exciting.
Well, we have a tentative site. So in a way, because it's a full block, not the full city block, but it is a 2-corner site. And it's not confirmed yet, but at the same time, because it's a good representation of a footprint and becomes kind of the ideal footprint for what the vertical farm requires, we have proceeded with the design. So it's nothing that's become public yet. We're still working towards putting forth the proposal in the new year. But we would hope that by the end of next year, we would actually have the first design complete.
That's so great. I love it. You also talk about broadening the concept of accessibility to go beyond designing for those with disabilities. Can you talk about that? What you mean by go beyond designing for disabilities?
So I think I mentioned a moment ago that in working with so many different great cultural institutions, schools, community centers, and so many of them have free programming, libraries and such. And yet it was surprising to us how few people used the programming. I'm talking, even the immediate neighbors were not using them. And we started to inquire why that was. And it was eye-opening to us to understand kind of the socioeconomic barriers or perceived barriers that really weren't there. We weren't addressing physical barriers that kept people from accessing it. We were thinking about what are all the other, is it about visibility? Is it about literal transparency? Is it about institutional transparency? But we realized that accessibility, has so many different scales and, from are the resources visible? Are the resources something, are they housed within something that is inviting? Must you rely on someone making the decision to access those resources, or do you provide some way in which there is a serendipitous journey or, opportunity that you connect them to something before they decide to connect? And by that, I mean, for our cultural center in downtown Brooklyn is a really good example. That will house, 4 of the greatest New York City cultural institutions. We're so excited, and they're such an incredible group to work with. You've got 651 Arts, which is an incredible performing arts group. Mokata, Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Arts, credible visual arts group. And then, probably ones you recognize, Brooklyn Public Library, Brooklyn Academy of Music, putting them all together under one roof and understanding, as we all did after COVID too, that we're stronger together than we are apart. And so how do you design this facility such that, it isn't simply a cultural mall with everyone in their own respective areas, but if someone's, if you think that perhaps someone is there more likely to see a movie, just going to the movies, but if they have to traverse past a new artist exhibition or, see, a new dance studio or, the idea being that you can expose them to new resources, new cultural opportunities, and build patronage for some of these other groups through, the access to what they assumed was the reason for their visit. So the idea being that really thinking about how you can foster connections, and really maximize, everyone's opportunity to find new relationships with people, new ideas, new connections to, again, either much needed resources with food and those bare essentials to the aspirational kind of wonderful cultural programming and other things that our past libraries and galleries have afforded. So it's, going back to, when I thought I was going to be a neuroscientist, is just how do you foster those connections, and how do you connect, if you ever design a building and build it and the only thing that lights up is the building itself, you've missed a huge opportunity. When you plug that new intervention into the urban fabric, other things should light up. You should be connecting to existing networks, hopefully fostering new, and it should have a greater impact than, that immediate property boundary.
That's great. I really love that you're trying to really collaborate, connect, and, involve everyone in the community. So we talked about this, 6 months ago when we first spoke. Can you talk about your project in Cleveland? I have to bring that up because I'm in Cleveland, Ohio, and I really enjoyed our conversation about how you landed the NASA Glenn Research Center out of thousands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't pretend to know how many people responded to the original RFP or RFQ, but it was a solicitation put out by the GSA under their Design Excellence program. And I want to say that was back, I can't remember the exact dates, but let's say it's somewhere in the 2014, 2015 time.
That was way before.
Yeah. And, the original solicitation spoke about an office building within the, historic campus of the Glenn Research Center at NASA that is in Cleveland, Ohio, right adjacent to the International Airport, as you know. And the criteria, as with all solicitations, they always have evaluating criteria. And I believe, it was a series of obviously firms with design excellence. Have you worked for a government entity before? Have you designed an office building in the United States? And the list went on. And, I received it and kind of looked at what the requirements were. And I think every answer was a no, except for design excellence. We had never worked, with a United States government agency before, nor done an office building for them. And again, it was across the board no. But what drew me to respond was, I think, what I thought the project should be and not what they were asking us to submit for. And, I thought to myself, NASA has some of the greatest minds, in the world. And here's this community on this campus. And I can't imagine that there's a greater group of people to connect than this group to each other and all. And from, Google Maps, which of course that's what that's our first image of any place, when we're looking. It seemed to be just this disparate collection of buildings, on this half circle. And, coming from New York, which the public realm is everything, and the grid, it just seemed very hard to understand how this community, at least it wasn't evident from above how they were connected. So when we went to the interview, we were asked, there were two buildings that were requested. It was the research support building, which was for the most part, this shared office building. And then there was an administration building for which was kind of a phase 2. And we did an analysis of the campus, which really wasn't actually part of our scope, but seemed so critical to do, because how can you intervene into a campus and into a context not really understanding how it functions? And we found all these opportunities to utilize existing space. And the one thing that we couldn't find, again, was any sort of common ground, for the exterior. Now, I know Cleveland's weather is not unlike New York, so it's not Miami. So it's not as if, you can use the outdoor space all the time, but the reality is we all still need it, and we all still use it to the extent that we can. And so we went to the interview really saying that, this is about reconnecting the campus through the introduction of this new building. And, how could we build this common ground? So we really pushed back on the notion of an office building, right? We really pushed back. And obviously, at the end of the day, it still contained offices, but we were really just trying to think of this as this social infrastructure, not unlike NASA's incredible pieces of infrastructure that you see, in their designs for the Mars rover and rockets and such. But I guess, they were asking for a government office building, and we were trying to kind of put forth, just a common space, a community space. And so therefore we didn't need to know about an office building, and we didn't need to know about working with the government. What we needed to know, we've been able to understand with every client we've ever worked on before, which is we're going to immerse ourselves to understand the culture of NASA, because we can't do anything unless we fully understand that. And we understand that you have to, the future of NASA is dependent on attracting incredible new talent. And, you have to have this beautiful piece of architecture that, performs for you in the way you need it to perform. And the greatest thing it can do is to optimize and celebrate your greatest resource, human capital. And that's true of everybody. Obviously, for NASA, we love the fact that when we work with the clients that we work for, all of them are in positions of, working for the city. So many of our clients do great things for the city and keep the city running. And NASA, their goal is to improve, do global good. So the fact that we can design a building for NASA that makes them perform better, that has this positive global impact, is incredibly rewarding. So we had the interview, we left the interview, not sure, because again, they asked a question and we reframed the question, answering our question. And they, called me up, I guess 2 or 3 weeks later and said, "I'm sorry to inform you." And of course my heart dropped. He said, "You're going to be working with us for the next 5+ years." So, and I have to say it was a wonderful collaboration, because we really got to know how NASA worked so well and feel like we reflected that culture of functionalism and aspiration in the building itself. That was one of, the many catalysts that really made me say, this is what I want to be doing, which is working with these mission-driven clients to provide them, a piece of infrastructure that makes them resilient and more impactful in the future.
That's very exciting. I can't wait for the building to. I mean, is it under construction or
No,
not
it's
yet?
done. It's done.
Oh, okay. But you're coming over, right? Because you're coming back for a site visit.
The building's constructed. It was funny because, to be honest, I've not even really promoted the building. It's been constructed, but it was finished during COVID. With so many of our projects, there were so many challenges to, between sites being shut down versus the supply chain issue, which is, still presenting problems. But so the project actually finished last year. We did not announce it because NASA didn't want to announce it, obviously, until there were, a plan for people to, come, into it. And people hadn't been called back to the campus. They were still all working remotely. So we're happy to say the building is complete. We've had it photographed. The landscape is not yet complete because that was postponed during COVID. I'm hoping that we will address that in the coming year. And that, the landscape is a huge component, because if you were looking at the building now from Google Earth, and that fifth elevation is actually really important, not just because of how often we see buildings that way, but because it's NASA. It was important that we understand what it looked like from space. And also you can see it from the adjacent airport. But the building is actually an X marks the spot where the kind of new center of campus is. But that X even more meaningfully defines these outdoor courtyards that hopefully will foster great exhibitions of their newest accomplishments and inventions and job fairs, and they're an incredibly close community. So the social events have really needed a place. I think NASA sent me some photos. They just had their campus-wide picnic there. So it's already, even without the landscape being done, it's already fostering those types of events and connections that we were hoping for.
Congratulations, Andrea. I really want to visit when you're around. So let's talk about the business of architecture. I always say that architects were taught how to master their craft, but not taught how to grow or run a business. And it seems like you have managed to do all that, and your firm is running like a well-oiled machine. So my question for you is, where did you get your business savvy? Like, number one, and number two, who was the first person you hired outside of architects? Like, was it an admin staff, finance? Like, yeah, I just want to learn how you got to be so savvy in business.
Well, I don't know that I would classify myself as savvy in business. I would say that I use architecture to kind of define how we approach the business, but I am supported by great people who understand what architects can do and what they can't do. So I do have an incredible CFO. I do have, great marketing people to support that. But in the broader spectrum of architecture and business, I would say, I think architects have, unfortunately, the profession of architecture, I think, has been marginalized in many ways, in the sense of architecture was promoted for a long time as, the starchitects and, bringing kind of great visions, and oftentimes those visions were defined as brands, and it was really about the kind of artistic vision. And obviously I still aspire to architecture as being a great source of beauty and inspiration. But I do think that as architects, again, broadening the spectrum of our responsibility and our reach is, again, to say, my studio works with the client sometimes before a site is selected, often before a program is even fully baked, to say, why are you building? Why are you building? And if the answer at the end of the day doesn't get you to know that what we build you can sustain, and it doesn't foster success in all meanings of the word, then we probably shouldn't build. And so from a business model, what I'm still learning and still trying to do is to understand that the value of architects is in the rigor of the design process, to understand that, I guess the ideal client for us, the ideal project is not a specific type. It's not there's no too small a scale, too large a scale, or ideal client, but it is the client who recognizes that their financial status or their kind of social impact or their programming can be defined and improved through the design process. That it's not about them giving us the program and, the financial and just say, here, this is the building we need to design. But hopefully we will actually have had an impact on their culture and their institution as a whole by the end of the design process. And then obviously even more so when the building is executed. So right now, through these last 2 years, after the pivot, and then again with kind of the head down during COVID to say, what is it we really want? All of the projects that we're seeing come to fruition now in terms of starting design, whether it's the agricultural center, we're doing an education and wellness regenerative farm, looking to do some new school typologies and, even a different approach to mixed use residential within the city. All of these have come from starting with the client who had an idea about what impact they would want to have. And before naming it, before defining it as a fixed thing, working with them to kind of generate, side by side, what this is. Is it a new typology? What the business model is? I'm never going to understand fully all the finances that go into it. That's still what they're doing, but we certainly want to understand all of the challenges and the parameters that define that, so that as architects we can kind of respond to that and certainly align ourselves to kind of the same goal. So I know that's, maybe not an answer specific to how do you run the day to day to the business, but I think in a larger sense, I think architecture will continue to be more challenging as, it's a wonderful profession. It's a really hard business. And I think the business side of things are easier if you actually do a more engaging and fulfilling and immersive design process, which again is being there to help the client understand the need. What is the need of the project and how do you align at the start? So often when a client walks in the door and they have a site and they have a program and all these other things, it's incredible how many decisions have been made when you think you're just starting the design process. So when we've been able to start, truly at the beginning and align all of those, it's amazing how many things we can achieve within a tight budget and a tight schedule and really exceed what we would have otherwise. And that's good business. You have a great project, you have a happy client, you create these resilient pieces of infrastructure that are flourishing. And, it also allows us to push our investigations, much further and build from one project to the next. So that creates certain efficiencies so that, yes, we've learned that before. Now we're going to take those efficiencies and use them not to necessarily, churn out a bunch of things, but in fact, to be able to then refocus our energies on that which is unique, that which is new. And how we can push those investigations further and further. So I think that there are a lot of great firms, speaking about how we can be more engaged. There are great firms that are putting forth even different business models for how do you run a firm. And I think this is a great moment for us that we need to really embrace and question some of the practices that we've done in the past and how we can be greater stewards of the environment and of the community as a whole, and of the client's resources.
I think also what you said really resonated with me. Like when you have the good clients that understand and that you're aligned with, then everything else seems to flow, right? Because a lot of problems happen when the clients and the architects don't get along, and there's a lot of financial difficulties and progress billing. But since your clients are with you from the beginning, even programming, site selection, it makes it more collaborative and easier, I suppose, correct?
It does. Well, and also it's just, again, I fault us collectively as the profession to educate the public on what it is that architects can do. And when they understand, again, I'm not going to be the one to write their business model or define the operations, but when they understand that all of that can be at least fostered by the design process and accounted for within the built building, when the site is selected, irrespective of the things you learn through the process and the program, people typically give you a list of program, right? And that list is wonderful. It's a series of names and spaces, but those only account for the 3 dimensions of space, right? What often isn't considered in drafting a program is the 4th dimension, which is really the most important one and the greatest resource we have, time. When you think about how time plays into the space and how spaces can be utilized at different times, or how you can, conceive of this thing as a more dynamic system, then oftentimes you can reduce the amount of space that you build, or you can share your resource with other needs, and then you become more resilient. And so if people understood that the design process was not just a means to an end, it is a critical development to get to the building. But, if everyone embraced it as a learning process and one that should enrich all sides, not just the architect learning to get again to the building design, I think that as a profession, we could be much more impactful.
Thank you for that. So now that we're wrapping up to the end of the podcast, I always ask this: who is Andrea outside of ASA? What do you do for fun?
That's a good question. There are hours that don't get fully absorbed by the studio. I would say, obviously, the go-to is family. I've got my children here, my two children and my husband. And I know that right now, so many of us are doing kind of the hybrid or sometimes working from home, and you think, oh, well, I'm, here more often. But again, time being the most precious resource, I've found later in life, I'm trying very hard to kind of strike that balance. I'm hoping travel is in the future. I think all of us are anxious to reconnect with the rest of the world. So we've started to do some travel. And we're trying to plan. We were all together in Costa Rica, reconnecting. We rented a place in the rainforest, and
Wow.
it was some of the most incredible wildlife and nature that I've been privileged to be exposed to. So that was incredible. But there isn't enough of it. So
I know.
and
That was
maybe I'll say this, and maybe when I come to see you in Ohio. So I think we obviously have to come visit. So maybe I'll align our meetup then too.
Definitely. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I would love to meet you. And I mean, NASA is probably very private, so I don't think public people can just go there. So I would love to see it when you're in
Oh,
town.
absolutely. No, we'll do a private
last
tour.
question.
Yeah.
Yes. Last question.
Mm-hmm.
What is next for ASA? And where do you see yourself in 3
What's
years?
next for ASA, I think, is an incredible learning curve with our clients for these new projects, the vertical farms, regenerative farms, all of these projects, because of the new typologies. I think we're really excited to collaborate with some incredible firms. There are some amazing, innovative engineering firms and technical collaborators. And so my hope is next year, we are working on, a dozen different buildings, all of which are ranging from, the smallest 10,000 square foot school project in the Bronx to, several million square feet of residential and urban farming, and, really building a small piece of the city in Harlem, hopefully. And, all of them, I think, our hope is that while we have always been interested and all of our work has been LEED certified and sustainability is at the root of what we do, I think sustainability, even as a notion, is, behind us, and the idea of resiliency and regenerative architecture. So we're really interested to kind of push the boundaries on that again with wonderful collaborations with amazing consultants and, push the boundaries on what's possible in 2023.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you. It was incredible to have this time with you.
That was Andrea Steele of Andrea Steele Architecture.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Architect My Life, a podcast brought to you by the MGS Global Group. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to add to the conversation through your own experiences, I encourage you to be a guest on one of our upcoming episodes. Visit architectmylife.com/apply to learn how. I firmly believe that a strong community drives change and fosters success. If you'd like to be part of this community, join the All-Female Architect My Life Facebook group. Please take a moment to review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. Be sure to follow me on Instagram at aya_architectmylife and Architect My Life Podcast. Thanks again for listening. I'm Aya Shlachter. Until next time.